Welcome to Aligning Carbon and Biodiversity Offsets, the fourth session in the web forum series Land Use 2021, A Place for Biodiversity Offsets, brought to you by the Alberta Land Institute. My name is Dave Poulton. I'm director of the Institute, and I'll be your host for today's session. The Alberta Land Institute is a nonpartisan land use policy research institute based at the University of Alberta in Edmonton, Alberta. You can learn more about us by visiting the ALI Expo booth. You'll see the Expo icon on the left side of your screen. We respectfully acknowledge that we at the University of Alberta are located on Treaty 6 territory, a traditional gathering place for diverse Indigenous peoples, including the Cree, Blackfoot, Métis, Nakota Sioux, Iroquois, Dene, Ojibwe, Saulteaux, Anishinaabe, Inuit, and many others whose histories, languages, and cultures continue to influence our vibrant community. The modern world is faced with twin global environmental crises, rising temperatures and declining biodiversity. As we consider measures to address each of these situations, it's critical that we avoid a siloed approach, risking solutions to one problem that exacerbate the other. It would be much better if we could find a set of measures that tackle both problems together. Offsetting has been used as a greenhouse gas management and mitigation tool for several years, with varying degrees of credibility and success. Biodiversity offset systems are increasingly common and sophisticated as we've explored through this series. So can and should we combine carbon and biodiversity offsetting? That's the focus of today's discussion. Now let me turn to today's speakers. Their biographies are located below the stage screen, so I will keep my introduction short. Today we welcome Royal Gardner, who is Professor of Law and Director of the Institute of Biodiversity Law and Policy at Stetson University in Gulfport, Florida. Amrei van Hase is a returning speaker, and she's a conservation ecologist working in Cape Town, South Africa. Amrei was the science lead for BBOP, the Business and Biodiversity Offset Program, an international multi-stakeholder collaboration that operated from 2004 to 2018. And finally, Manuel Piñuela is a nature advocate and science entrepreneur, co-founder of Cultivo, and several other businesses based on the provision of ecosystem services. And to lead today's session, we're very pleased to welcome Stewart Elgie. Stewart is founder and chair of the Smart Prosperity Institute at the University of Ottawa, where he's also professor of law and economics. He's also one of Canada's most well-known and respected environmental lawyers. Stewart, please join me on the screen. Good morning, Stewart, and I will leave.
That's a miraculous, okay. Okay, well, Dave appears to have done a little snagglepuss and exited stage left. You can tell I have little kids, so over to me. Hello, everybody. I'm moderating the session today, and I will chime in at the end for a little bit of Canadian content based on what some of our international speakers say about biodiversity and carbon offsets worldwide. But I'll start with my moderator hat on. And let me just set up the session. Okay, so as Dave said, the focus today is combining climate and biodiversity offsets. The context for that, this is me figuring out how to make this thing work. Okay, I have to be in my slides to make it forward. All right. Is smart prosperity. Dave mentioned a little bit about that. We are an environment economy research network and think tank. In Canada, we're small, so we have to combine the two into one place. Based out of University of Ottawa, we have a network that includes over 100 scholars from across Canada and the world, including some of the people on this line, I'm sure, and a number of chairs at University of Ottawa. We do a significant amount of research in this program area about how do you drive what we call a nature smart economy, that one in which we generate wealth while also minimizing impacts on climate and biodiversity. Let's look specifically about what that means. So as Dave said, there are really two twin challenges, and all of you know them, so I'm not telling you stuff you don't know. One of them is biodiversity loss, about a 2/3 decline in species since 1970, according to the Living Planet Index. And about 1 out of 5 of those species is affected by climate change, and that number will rise, obviously, over time, depending how effective we are at dealing with climate change. There are some pretty significant estimates of species loss by 2100 if we don't get climate change under control. And you see in the right-hand column there, the Living Planet Index showing differential declines by continent, but overall a downward trend for all biodiversity. At the same time, climate change, front and center in the news and policy making. Climate CO2 levels about 50% higher than pre-industrial levels and rising. We'll be lucky to keep global warming within 2 degrees at this rate. Some say that even 3 degrees may be tough. And nature and biodiversity has a big overlap with that, in that something like 20% of greenhouse gas emissions come from land use related activities, forestry, farming, wetland management, peatlands. And so there's a real intersection between these two problems, climate being a significant problem for biodiversity, land use being a significant part of the climate problem. And because of that, there's a growing focus on tackling both of these issues together. There were the 2 major conventions coming out of the Rio Earth Summit in 1992, and increasingly at the COPs that happen each year, I think we'll see increasing focus on how do we work together for nature-based climate solutions that try to address both these problems at once. And there is significant potential for those kind of win-wins. This is just a Canadian analysis, and I apologize to the non-Canadians, but we get a lot of nature in Canada. This is analysis we did last year with Green Analytics, trying to overlap CO2 offset hotspots, which you see on the top left, with protected area and biodiversity hotspots on the right. And you can see a fair amount of overlap. And the preliminary numbers we did, and these really are preliminary, suggested there were something like 55 million tons of potential additional CO2 sequestration in Canada from better land use and conservation. That's probably within an order of magnitude, and better numbers are coming out now. But the point is, there's a lot of potential to do both. So that's what today's session is about. We're going to talk about how we can use offset systems to address both climate and biodiversity goals. We're going to hear from a series of great speakers, and they're going to talk about the different tools you can do. Stacking, which essentially is taking CO2 and biodiversity offsets from a project and selling them separately, or bundling, taking those same 2 offsets and selling them together as a package deal. We may hear a little bit also about the idea of injecting biodiversity requirements into CO2 offsets, which I'm going to call blending. And maybe at the end, if our speakers haven't talked about it, another option is combining payments for ecosystem services with offsets. The advantage of that is that an offset, by definition, doesn't give you a net gain. You're trading one CO2 reduction for a CO2 increase, one biodiversity loss for a biodiversity gain, whereas a payment for ecosystem service program can achieve a pure net gain in CO2 or biodiversity. We'll talk more about that later, but this is just conceptually, there's different ways of thinking about how you take these 2 units and combine them together. The one thing I'm going to say just for context is that in these conversations, we often blend voluntary and regulated offset markets. And I think it's important to point out that having regulation as a driver of offsets results in much larger and usually much higher priced markets. So if you look at CO2 markets, for example, more than 99% of offsets around the world occur under regulated markets as opposed to voluntary. And for biodiversity, about 97% occur in regulated markets. And the reason is simple, which is if there's a regulation requiring an offset, that's a much more powerful and far-reaching incentive than corporate social responsibility or voluntary pledges. Not to undermine the importance of those. Those are critical to get those started and to go further. But ultimately, moving towards regulation as a foundation for offsets is going to drive much more of this, and regulation as a foundation for bringing them together in those kind of combined approaches. So let me stop there with the setup and turn it over to our first of our 3 speakers, Amrei von Hase. I won't reintroduce him because Dave's already done that, but we'll hear from Amrei, Royal, and Manuela. And then at the end, I'll add a few comments from a Canadian perspective, and then we'll turn it over to questions. Thanks. Amrei, over to you.
Thank you. Hello to everyone. It's lovely to be here. So I have been asked to present a very brief overview from an international perspective on how biodiversity and carbon are being integrated, and in particular how stacking and bundling feature in this regard. And so what I've done is I've picked just a few examples to illustrate that. Just to give you a little bit of context, so we've heard a lot about no net loss, net gain, and mitigation policies involving biodiversity offsets in these sessions already, and we know that they're on the rise globally. And several initiatives have worked hard to support this process with best practice guidance, especially on offsets. For example, the Business and Biodiversity Offset Program that Dave mentioned earlier, and more recently, the IUCN's thematic group on impact mitigation and ecological compensation. And there are parallel trends relating to climate change mitigation and the role of carbon offsets. Nature-based solutions have strongly come into focus recently, and programs are being framed around these. And all of those have particular outcomes in mind. So it's important to understand how they can reinforce each other to create synergies rather than trade-offs. And given the controversy around offsets in particular, both biodiversity offsets and carbon offsets, what if you put the two together? So that was a question that came up repeatedly while we were working with the Business and Biodiversity Offsets program. Project developers and offset providers were keen to know whether they could align their biodiversity offsets with REDD+ projects, for example, on the same site. And more broadly, also policymakers and practitioners want to know how to devise schemes that incentivize and promote the provision of multiple ecosystem services and benefits rather than single services, so just carbon sequestration, for example, and how to ensure that the risks, such as the overall loss of services, for example, are limited and that good outcomes for biodiversity and for people can be achieved. And so stacking and bundling are possible approaches in that regard. So in response to repeated questions around these issues, and particularly relating to best practice in compensation, which was our job at Bebop, my colleagues Jan Kasson and Kerry Tenkata and I did a piece of work a few years ago that resulted in a briefing note on what we call the theory and practice of stacking and bundling. So these can be seen as different ways of packaging multiple ecosystem services, or sometimes those are called nature's contributions to people, that are produced on a piece of land for use in environmental compensation programs and in conservation incentive schemes. So we looked at the literature, most of which came from the US, and what was happening around the world in practice. And we then set out what appeared to be the most appropriate definitions, perceived benefits, risks communicated by stakeholders, and we described selected case studies and drew some conclusions and recommendations based on that. And I'll share a few of these cases with you to show different solutions and experiences that we came across. So the first example looks at voluntary forest carbon, voluntary forest carbon markets. And here standards and certification systems have been developed, such as the Voluntary Carbon Standard, VCS, which can be combined with certification according to the Climate, Community and Biodiversity Standards, or CCB standards. And those ensure that eligible land management projects adopt best practice and multiple benefits approaches in their design and implementation. Sorry, I'm just, here we go. So to be certified, a carbon offset project, such as a REDD+ project, needs to assess and demonstrate clear benefits for biodiversity and local communities alongside its principal climate mitigation benefits. And while carbon offset markets trade in credits that are based on units of carbon, buyers of VCS and CCB certified offsets are specifically interested in carbon-related services that come with a bundle of other services. And those benefits are all delivered together at a single site, and they can't be disaggregated and separately valued or sold. And that's important because there are no equally strict requirements on the buyer's side as on the supplier's side to determine any impacts on biodiversity or community-related services that might be associated on the impact side with greenhouse gas emissions. So there is a risk of asymmetry on the two sides of the question if the two were stacked, so-called. So there is some evidence that carbon offsets, which provide a clear bundle of services, so biodiversity and social services as well, have advantages for market participants. So they're almost a prerequisite for entry in the voluntary market. And there's also evidence that a large and growing number of buyers of voluntary forest carbon offsets actually choose those with certified biodiversity and social co-benefits. Turning back to the question of whether voluntary biodiversity offset projects undertaken by companies with residual impacts on biodiversity, for example, could be overlaid with the REDD+ project, the answer in a nutshell was unfortunately no. And there are several reasons for that, with the simplest being that best practice biodiversity offsets and best practice carbon offsets have stringent additionality requirements. So outcomes need to be over and above what would have happened anyway for both types of offsets. And these additionality requirements would allow that kind of stacking to happen. So my second example comes from Australia, and of interest here are 2 federal and 1 state policy relevant to offsetting. So first of all, the Carbon Farming Initiative, or CFI, and Carbon Credits Act enable land managers to obtain carbon credits through better land management that stores carbon, for example, through reforestation. And projects must demonstrate additionality relative to a business as usual baseline, and permanence of offset outcomes is required. Then secondly, there's the Federal Environmental Protection and Biodiversity Conservation, or EPBC Act, and its biodiversity offset policy. And this applies when proposed developments affect biodiversity of national significance. This policy does not allow a biodiversity offset to be provided on top of a carbon offset, and it in fact explicitly states the conservation gain achieved while participating in another scheme, such as the Carbon Farming Initiative, would also not be eligible for use as a biodiversity offset. In contrast, however, and interestingly, the New South Wales offset policy for major developments formally enables the stacking and unbundling of biodiversity offsets and carbon offsets. And this states that the same site can potentially generate both biodiversity credits and carbon credits through the same management actions. So this policy position is counter to the EPBC biodiversity offset policy and the Carbon Farming Initiative, and it's drawn criticism from various stakeholders. So apart from the legality of the policy position, which was unresolved at the time, concerns include the lack of additionality and the risk of double dipping or double counting, and the associated net loss of biodiversity. So only with complete symmetrical accounting of all carbon and biodiversity losses and gains across all affected sites and operations, so on the impact on offset side, could these risks be alleviated. My third example is from Germany. And here, impact assessment, mitigation measures, and ecological compensation are also regulated under federal law. And compensation can be delivered by conservation banks, or so-called compensation pools, that can be operated by a range of different institutions. And one of those is the Compensation Agency in Brandenburg. In addition to providing compliance-driven offsets for residual ecological impacts, this Brandenburg Flächenagentur was keen to sell voluntary carbon offsets as well. since it was aware of some of the issues associated with that, and to resolve questions around whether or how to bundle or stack these different types of credits in a robust way, the agency had lots of discussions with key stakeholders and decided not to stack and unbundle its credits and payments, but rather to implement two sort of different strategies. The first was to target spatially separate lands as either compensation pools dedicated to providing ecological compensation related credits, or peatlands for voluntary carbon offsets, so completely separating these in space. And secondly, to develop projects in lands where the two different credit types are quantified and explicitly related to each other using a detailed methodology, and then stacked but not unbundled. And those decisions were made to ensure the clear additionality of the ecological outcomes, and so to limit the risk of an overall or net loss of services, and also to safeguard the integrity of the credits provided and assure the credibility of the agency. And then last, before closing, I'd just like to highlight one initiative which I find really interesting, and that's the Willamette partnership in Oregon in the US, which has worked extensively with a range of stakeholders from different levels of government and farmers and conservation groups to pilot multiple benefits approaches and develop robust mechanisms for trading a range of different credit types in one marketplace, with the idea of supporting landowners in whole system restoration, so targeting lots of different ecological and ecosystem benefits. And the work was initiated specifically in recognition of the fact that landowners often provide a range of benefits, for example, by undertaking ecological restoration, and often only very few of those are valued under US regulations, for example, the Clean Water Act, or in environmental markets such as voluntary carbon markets. And so this effort over many years has led to a defensible accounting and measurement protocol that sets out how different credit types can be generated by a single restoration project, so on the same site, how the different credits relate to each other, how additionality is assessed, and how funding received from public conservation incentive programs actually fits into the picture. So while the same area and management activities can contribute to multiple credit types, and these are essentially stacked, a key safeguard again here is that the credits cannot be unbundled. So when one type of credit is sold, the associated other credits must be retired. And the reason for not unbundling credits are the interrelatedness of the various functions ecologically, so they're quite hard to pass apart, and of the outcomes and credits. Again, issues around additionality and the potential for double dipping. So from this work, it's clear that there's a number of issues that need to be addressed when thinking about how to develop robust systems for multiple services. And that especially goes for compensation schemes where there's a risk of an overall loss of services if appropriate safeguards aren't integrated. But the examples also hint at a set of different solutions, and they offer some useful lessons. And one of these is really to be aware of the complexity and to plan early and well. And that should involve things such as setting the scene and clarifying objectives and desired outcomes, what needs to be achieved, what is the intended outcome. Are we talking about compensation schemes where even more care needs to be taken given the potential for bad outcomes if safeguards aren't included? Or are we talking about conservation incentive schemes where bang for buck is nevertheless an important concern? Or are we talking about both? Then to investigate the available options and to understand the implications, including for the environment and for the design and functioning of the scheme. So that looking at options and implications would include reviewing available additionality tests, of which there are several, and what they mean, the kinds of measurement and accounting required for robust approaches, the capacity needed for those involved to apply and provide oversight, the costs and benefits, and what supporting systems and coordination is needed between policy standards and regulatory regimes, and then to design the scheme. And another useful thing is also to undertake pilots, and this is a good way of collecting information and gaining experience and informing policy and program design. And then last but not least, I think some sort of take-home messages from our review would be, when in doubt, bundle, don't stack. And when considering stacking, there is help available. There's some useful options and rules of thumb that have been set out by colleagues in the US in particular, and they provide a useful starting point and offer guidance to those who are keen to venture into this direction. And I think with that, I would like to say thank you, and I can turn over to Royal Gardner, who has got a lot more to say on stacking. Thank you very much.
All right. Good day, everyone. Thanks, Amrei, for setting the stage, and thanks, Stewart, for the overview, and thank you to Dave and everyone at the Alberta Land Institute for the opportunity to speak with you and participate in this great series. I am typically located in Florida. I'm actually speaking to you from Oakland, California. You might be able to see in the background there some sequoias actually sequestering carbon as we speak. So I thought this was an appropriate venue. I'd like to provide some stacking and unbundling examples from the United States. And as I do so, a couple of points to keep in mind. These examples involve mostly regulated markets. So both Stewart and Amrei talked about that. So these are not voluntary markets for the most part. There's a law or a regulation that's a driver for the offset. And most also involve biodiversity and not necessarily carbon offsets, but nevertheless, there are lessons learned that may be applicable to trying to align carbon and biodiversity offsets. So we had a poll question you may be able to see. So if you have an opportunity, check it out. Just interested in terms of how familiar you are with one of the earliest environmental markets, which was the acid deposition program in the United States. This came about from the 1990 Clean Air Act amendments, which was actually led by the Republicans. The Republicans were in favor of this cap and trade program. And it was as you may know, it was a cap and trade program for sulfur dioxide and nitrogen oxides, and covered utilities were assigned a certain number of allowances, how much they could pollute. And if a utility took an action to reduce emissions, installing pollution control equipment or switching fuel, for example, that could result in lowering emissions and thus producing excess allowances, essentially SO2 and nitrogen oxide credits. And these allowances could be traded. So this program is often trotted out as an example of an early large-scale environmental credit market, but it's also an example of stacking and unbundling. The same conservation action created two types of credits, sulfur dioxide credits and nitrogen oxide credits. And these credits could actually be unbundled and sold to different utilities. So stacking and unbundling have really been with us since the beginning. A lot of my work involves wetland mitigation banking in the United States. And so these are offsets that are produced by third parties, often restoration companies that will restore wetlands or streams, thus generating these wetland or stream credits that are then sold to developers who need them to offset their permitted impacts. Now, like many biodiversity-based credits, a wetland credit represents a suite of functions. In the early days of wetland mitigation banking, wetland credits were based on area. So it was a very rough proxy for all wetland functions. But we now have more refined measurements that take into account the condition of the mitigation site as well as the impact site and consider specific functions that these sites provide. And so accordingly, some Corps of Engineers districts, in our country, the Corps is the regulatory agency for bizarre historical reasons, but different Corps districts actually assess and track different functional credits, such as flood control, habitat, water quality, and in some cases, even carbon sequestration. But they haven't taken the step to unbundle. So that is the credit or the offset is still limited to a particular type of wetland credit. And that is in part because unbundling a wetland credit, which could include carbon sequestration, can be challenging and controversial, as Amrei mentioned, when the ecosystem functions are interdependent and integrated. One notorious example involved a mitigation bank in the state of North Carolina. In 2000, the bank, and when I say bank, we're not talking about a financial institution, we're talking about a private restoration company. So this restoration company sold about 250 wetland credits for $3.8 million to offset highway project impacts. And so the credits were based on restoration and preservation actions at 3 different sites. A number of years later, the restoration company then asked the state of North Carolina to certify nutrient offset credits, water quality credits from the same area, and the state approved that. So the company then sold the nutrient offsets for $700,000 to offset new highway impacts. Ultimately, that led to a review by the state that found that this resulted in a net loss of ecological functions, as well as a waste of taxpayers' money, and led to a moratorium on nutrient offset credits being derived from land that was also used to produce wetland credits. What's the problem with that? Well, first of all, the water quality component was sold when the wetland credit was sold. And also there was no additionality. The company, the banker, had done nothing additional to produce those nutrient offset credits. In contrast, a different state, the state of New Jersey, does allow credits from spatially overlapping areas to be unbundled, stacked and unbundled, and sold to different entities. Thus, a wetland mitigation bank site, which produces wetland credits, can also be used as a riparian zone bank, which produces riparian zone or flood control credits, which can be used to offset impacts regulated under a state law. New Jersey justifies this by saying that the functions and values of an area where wetlands and riparian zones occupy the same space where they overlap are higher than the functions and values of solely a wetland or riparian zone. I'm not really convinced. A wetland credit should already take into account the flood control function of the area, and so it seems like double dipping to me, where the same unit is sold twice. Let's shift to species credits. In the U.S., under the U.S. Endangered Species Act, impacts to species habitat can be offset through credits developed at a conservation bank, which is essentially the same, operates under the same principles as a wetland mitigation bank. So an area is restored or preserved for species, thus generating these species credits. Often a conservation action can benefit more than one species. So they're stacked, but can they be unbundled? And generally the rule is no. So for example, in Florida, we have conservation banks that have both scrub jay and sand skink credits. Sand skink's a type of lizard. And so if there is a developer who needs a scrub jay credit, but not a sand skink credit, they can purchase that, but then the sand skink credit is retired. Same thing if the developer needs simply a sand skink credit, but not the scrub jay credit, the sand skink credit is sold and the scrub jay credit is retired. But if the developer needs both types of credits, then they can be bundled to offset the impacts from a single project. Amrei had mentioned or noted one of the articles that I worked with on Jessica Fox on taking a look at these issues. And we did find one example of a single parcel that effectively generates two different types of species credits that are used to offset impacts from multiple projects. This is also in Florida. There is a preserve that is used to offset impacts to scrub jay as well as gopher tortoise. But what's different here is that there are two different conservation actions generating the credits. First, you have the preservation and maintenance of the site for scrub jay credits, but the site is also a recipient site for gopher tortoises. So gopher tortoises are actually relocated to the site from impact sites, from development sites. So here we literally have additionality. You're adding a gopher tortoise to the site. So turning to carbon and biodiversity credits, an interesting example from Florida where they were brought together, or at least contemplated about being brought together at the beginning of the process, is the Florida Panther Conservation Bank. When it was established, the banker, the restoration company, reserved the right to sell carbon credits with the approval of the regulatory agency, the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. The Fish and Wildlife Service was in favor of this. It actually thought that this might provide additional incentives to encourage the establishment of such banks. And it was important, though, that they reserved the agency reserved the right to approve that, so the Fish and Wildlife Service could ensure that the property wouldn't be managed for carbon to the detriment of the species. But this is in theory only, because there's no regulated market for carbon in Florida. So at most, it might be able to be used to generate some income from the voluntary markets. But we've seen in the United States, the voluntary markets don't necessarily produce the claimed benefits, as a recent Bloomberg report noted. Property owners in the U.S. have, some property owners have enrolled their sites in different conservation programs where the federal government pays them to manage their property for biodiversity benefits. And so under the Conservation Reserve Program or the Wetlands Reserve Program, these property owners are obligated to manage their land for conservation purposes. But now they're actually being paid additional money for carbon credits from the voluntary carbon market. And that's actually permitted under the federal regulations because we're dealing with a voluntary market. But they're being paid for to do something that they're already doing, that they're already obligated to do. So there's no real additionality in that area. So it is, as the article refers to it, simply selling hot air. In the past 4 years, I don't know if you noticed under the Trump administration, there were a lot of environmental issues on the agenda, but stacking and bundling was not one of them. Really, during the Trump administration, we were just trying to keep the regulatory drivers in place. So, for example, what waters are protected under the Clean Water Act. If you're not protecting waters and therefore developers don't need permits to fill them in, well, then the developers don't need offsets. And so all of this is a rather academic discussion. So we haven't been focusing too much on stacking and unbundling recently. I hope you in Canada develop some policies that we can learn from. But one policy that was developed recently, which considered stacking and unbundling, deals with environmental banks in coastal Louisiana. And the actual application of the policy is very limited, but for our purposes, what's important is that where you have functions that are interdependent and integrated, like carbon sequestration, it's generally not appropriate to unbundle them. So some of the takeaways or lessons from the U.S. experience could be that generally ecosystem credits that consist of a suite of functions should not be unbundled if you've already sold that overall ecosystem credit. Managing a site for one credit type should not denigrate the ecological values represented by the other credit types. Additionality is a continuing challenge. And another challenge is simply the complexity of stacking and unbundling. It requires agencies to have resources and expertise to properly assess, monitor, and verify specific functional gains and losses. And so that can be quite an expensive investment. So I will end there. I always like to end kind of on a happy note with pictures of my law students in Big Cypress National Preserve in the Western Everglades, just to sort of remind ourselves that really what we're doing is we're trying to protect these resources for the future generations. So thank you very much, and I look forward to the discussion.
Yes, and now we turn to Manuel Piñuela, who will actually bring us a new perspective in our series, that of an offset developer in the business of developing and selling offset credits. Manuel, over to you.
Thank you, Dave. As Dave mentioned, I'm hoping to bring a different lens or an additional lens to what has already been covered from a project perspective, and also very focused to my venture called Cultivo. And just to start with, our focus in Cultivo is to unlock investments into nature at scale. I invite everyone to see our video. Just due to some complexities with the setup, it was a bit jumpy when we tried to run it last time, but it really summarizes what we do in about 2 minutes. But I want to focus on where is it that Cultivo focuses on. And so the idea here is that we have seen that capital has, for a very long time, wanting to be deployed towards nature. And as my fellow speakers have mentioned over the last 2 talks, it has been going on actually for a while now. But I would say over the last year and a half, this has drastically accelerated. And the core issues that we found when money wants to flow towards nature is that either from financial institutions or corporations, is that there are very high transaction costs. There is a lack of trust, transparency, and understanding actually on what is going on a project. And it's very difficult to assess the financial investment. You could argue that it has to do with the fact that it's a new asset class, but primarily is that there is new language, new terms, but also there continues to be debate around those terms. But once we find those issues, what we do is at Cultivo is expose that through data. So Cultivo has developed a series of tools through its platform to expose all of the variables that are from our lens, required to understand what is the potential of investing into a specific project, both at the environmental and at the social level. So once the project starts, those tools that have been diagnosing and helping analyze the investment are then used to monitor the project itself. And then we start entering into, okay, there are inefficiencies on monitoring, reporting, and verification, and going through the different methodologies and registers that allow or not for stacking or bundling. But more importantly, when you're getting towards the end, as an off-taker downstream, you really don't want to be taking those offsets like an investor to not a high-quality project. When you're deploying capital to it, you want to make sure that the offsets or credits that you're acquiring are coming from a high-quality project that will not be open to attacks in the future. So there's also a lack of transparency there, a lack of standardization, and in general, so far up to date, there's been very poor data disclosure. So the solution that Cultivo brings to the market is one where we're using technology, using a repeatable investment process, but also making sure that the operations on the ground are verified by sensors. And this is allowing us to streamline not only cost, but actually that transparency data flow that we believe is fundamental to the whole space. So in essence, the way we look for projects is that we have this search engine for distressed natural assets, or our algorithms primarily through geospatial analysis and remote sensors that have been trained through ground truth sensors allow us to find the projects that would meet the specific criteria from our investments. For example, on a specific geography or a specific type of ecosystem or a specific type of offset or credit. We are by no means focused on carbon. We are very focused on the whole natural capital stack and the flows of services that comes from that stack. And we then package that investment, that project into a special purpose vehicle that we call a nature generator that is therefore streamlined to receive that investment, but more importantly, streamlined also to have, ideally, it's never seamless, but as seamless as possible operations, but also allow us to sell and market the outputs of those projects that is coming from those natural capital returns. So I wanted to show during my presentation a couple of just two projects, just to showcase through case studies some of the projects that we have in the pipeline or that have been launched through Cultivo and have received investment. So this one, for example, is a project in Florida. Clearly a thematic unscripted here, but with Roy. But the piece here is this project is primarily in an area that will have a significant space for agroforestry. The total project would expose to investors the full financial model where $23 million are required for the project to go through. And I will break down what is it that the project will go through. But the equity portion of those 23 million is 10 million. And so this nature generator, this special purpose vehicle is created to operate in this site in Florida, and it will have activities from, let's say, more wild restoration, as well as the agroforestry activity itself. And from an agroforestry activity, you will have trees that will be capturing carbon, and there will be captured carbon above and below ground, but more importantly, specifically for this site, the type of tree that is being used, not only it has species compatibility, but it has a very dense root system that allows for two things. One is that it does not need fertilizers because the tree itself captures nitrogen, but also it is very climate resilient. So for Florida, what that means is that this tree can be underwater for 2 weeks and don't die. So the series of revenues, and I'm going to break it apart from the stacking and bundling that has been discussed, because from a financial model perspective, the way we see it is that, for example, at $16 per ton, this project would be generating around $33 million. From biodiversity, it will be generating $4.5 million. From water storage payments, it would be receiving around $1 million. And more importantly, from the agroforestry business itself, even though the whole area is not just a plantation, it will be receiving $66 million. Of course, if you start taking the prices that either biodiversity or carbon are achieving in the markets, then agroforestry, compared to the ecosystem services of capturing carbon and protecting biodiversity, let alone the climate resilience that this could bring from a water perspective, could be equal to the agroforestry business. But an investor in Cultivo looking at this project would be looking primarily at the agroforestry set of revenues. But those revenues bring the cash flows that are required to have a target IRR of more than 12% and a multiple in invested capital of 3.1 times. These are really healthy returns that, as I mentioned at the beginning of my talk, are really attracting investors into the space. Now, another example that I want to share with you, which is focused on grasslands. This is a grassland project in the north of Mexico. It's a significant area. It's been in a desertification process for more than 30 years, primarily through traditional grazing practices. And it's a bit shy of 300,000 hectares, more being added there than the ones that you see. But even with the ones that you see on the screen, through regenerative grazing practices, the amount of carbon that this project can capture is 4.2 million tons of CO2. Very importantly, in this area, from its watershed, it's through proper restoration, it could capture 7.7 million cubic meters of water per year. And this is a project that is starting in a couple of months. In full blown, it has already started because baselines on both a biodiversity and a water and a carbon perspective have been achieved already. But this one requires way less capital. It has zero debt to it. It needs $3.2 million of an equity injection. And more importantly, what I want to share here is that this project, in this grassland, it has a significant impact on biodiversity, primarily birds. There are bison herds being introduced where they should have been for many, many years. But from an investment perspective, and this is also a distinction that I want to make from a very pragmatic investor's point of view, what an investor wants to see are the revenue streams. And regardless if it's stacked or bundled, what they care about is that the project itself has the capacity of protecting and ideally increasing biodiversity in the area, that is capturing carbon, and that it's bringing other benefits. Specifically for this project, water is the one that is the most interesting. It has significant social impacts because of this is an area of Mexico that goes through significant cultural and social pressures. But the break-even point for this project is at $7.1 per ton. Now, if you take a forecast of actually with a target of $16 per ton, this already has the target returns of 26% IRR, increased IRR, and a 3.2 times multiple on invested capital. So just to give you a sense as to what Cultivo is already analyzing and ready to start investing, is that we've looked through our technology stack, and we've looked at more than 150 million hectares, and those that landmass has been either shared through us with our partner NGOs or project developers all over the world, or we have found it through our search engine. But all projects are analyzed through our geospatial and remote sensing algorithms, and for which we've already generated a deeper analysis of 88 million hectares, but more importantly, ones that are already in our pipeline for investments. It's been more than 5 million, and to give you an idea, $25 million can go through 1.9 million hectares of land. That is a mix of ecosystems. Many, as you will see, are grasslands, and a grassland, if only focused on the natural capital stack and not the capital business, can take you a very long way because it has low capex. We're not benefiting from the capital business, compared to a mangrove or an agroforestry project where a heavy, a more capex intensive project will require a larger ticket size. But the idea is that with 1.9 million hectares of this blended mosaic set of ecosystems around the world, we could capture 89 million tons of CO2, capture 330 million cubic meters of water per year. And so I've just mentioned the process that we go through generally, and we do this with partners. And those partner organizations would be the experts on each one of those ecosystems or land activities. But I just want to bring it back to our topic, which is that from the boots on the ground to the investors to the off-takers, Cultivo's point of view is to be agnostic against the registries and the methodologies as far as two fundamental parts are kept, that it's, as Roy mentioned, that you're not double dipping or double counting, which is what has plagued the market for the last few years. And thankfully, more and more efforts being done by the registries to avoid that, but also making sure that this conversation between voluntary offsets and compliance offsets is, I just want to put it on the table, it's what we are already starting to see how it blends. And in fact, many voluntary carbon or voluntary credit off-taker is really looking forward to grandfathering those registries or methodologies into the compliance markets, as has already started to happen in a couple of industries. So I will stop there, but I'm looking forward to the panel discussion. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Manuel. And to all the speakers, we could easily have gone for an hour or more with the depth of expertise, but we're going to pull it over and turn it to questions. Dave, is there anything real time that you're instructing me on that I'm messing up on, or should I just plow ahead?
No, I was just kind of joining you. I thought I would join in the discussion for one thing. But also, before we get into the discussion, it might be a good time to direct our audience to our final poll, having had the benefit of hearing all the presentations and the thoughts on stacking and bundling and all the variations. We're asking people what they think the best way is to align biodiversity and carbon offsetting. We learned from the first poll that most people said they had a fair understanding of both types of offsetting systems. So we've got a good foundation to work from. So it'll be interesting to see what people think. And with that, I'll ask the others to rejoin us and turn it over to you, Stewart. And I'll just sit here in case I've got something to say.
You have a lot to say. Okay. Well, let's make a couple of quick comments from a Canadian perspective, since we've got a lot of Canadians online. And then maybe ask one or two questions of the panelists to follow up on the points you've raised. So hopefully you guys can see that. And I guess I'll go through this quickly, so we don't need to get into depth. But the point is, in Canada, we, unlike the US or apparently some other countries, we only have a limited number of regulated offset policies for biodiversity. Federally, our Fisheries Act has been around for a while, and it's probably the one that gets the most action. The Species at Risk Act has the potential for offsets, but it's new and relatively unused. Same for Impact Assessment Act. So unlike the US, where there are robust wetland and endangered species offset markets, in Canada, they're quite limited. There's a little bit more at the provincial level. This is a slide from Dave, so thank you. Mainly wetlands and a couple of other small ones like Ontario endangered species. So limited regulated market in Canada for ecosystem-based ones. Carbon ones are coming on strong. Quebec and Alberta have CO2 offset systems. Several provinces are developing them. BC has one for forest-based offsets now. Quebec is considering one. And the federal government is about to come in, we're told, with an offset program which will include forest management, which will really open up this market in Canada in a regulated way, really for the first time in a significant way. And there's been a major commitment in our latest budget for $4 billion for various types of nature-based solutions on forests or wetlands or agriculture. And the reason I point to that is this, and this pivots into what I want to ask some of my questions. So if we go back to the purpose of this panel, which is to look at how we achieve biodiversity and climate gains, again, just a reminder that an offset doesn't actually achieve a gain. And that's why these additionality issues that have been brought up time and again really matter. Like when you're offsetting, you're allowing more emissions to go up. in the name of emissions that you're sequestering in nature. So ensuring that the accounting is rigorous matters. But there are also ways of getting out of that no gain problem. And one of them, which was referred to a little bit, is the idea of injecting a biodiversity requirement into a CO2 offset. Ensuring that, let's say, a forest carbon offset has net biodiversity gain, or at least no net loss. And when you do that, you're getting the biodiversity benefits on top of the carbon credit. So you actually are contributing towards improving biodiversity. There are a bunch of questions about that, which we'll come to in the questions for our panelists. But the other one I just want to throw out, again, is I know we've got some Canadian policymakers on the line. Conceptually, the other thing you could do is the government could offer a top-up payment for biodiversity offsets on top of a carbon offset. So in this case, the market wouldn't be stacking. The market wouldn't be paying you for both a biodiversity and a CO2. The government would be doing it through a payment for ecosystem service program. So if you bought, let's say, a forest carbon offset, the government could offer $5 a ton on top of that, or $5 a biodiversity unit, as a way of helping to make it more marketable. But it wouldn't be an offset. It would simply be a payment for an ecosystem service. So all the additionality concerns we've talked about wouldn't come into play. So I throw that out just to throw a couple of more ideas into the mix that we haven't heard about. I'm going to stop sharing now and then pivot over to poking some questions at these great panelists, if that's okay. So let me start with going into the belly of the beast. We heard a bunch about the challenges of additionality, particularly additionality around stacking. But we also heard from Manuel about the benefits of being able to offer multiple services from the same project as a way of making these projects viable. And I think therein lies the rub. So let me push you guys a little bit and say, while additionality is challenging for stacking, it shouldn't be conceptually impossible. You could imagine, as Manuel showed, a project where, let's say, the CO2 returns alone don't make it financially viable, that you need to have CO2 plus biodiversity plus water, let's say. So for a financial additionality test, shouldn't it be viable to say, look, if a project developer can show that no one of these markets alone is financially additional, shouldn't we be allowed to stack in that case? And maybe you could use discounts or something as a way of hedging against the risk of asymmetrical information, which I know was an issue in those cases. But let me throw that out and see what you guys think. What can we do to get past this problem of additionality and stacking, or is it really insurmountable? Maybe
I'll go from our perspective, but really looking forward to see what Amrei and Roy think, because so to me, the piece there, Stewart, is that what everyone in the market is asking us is transparency in the data from the beginning, right? So as far as we can prove that what is behind the biodiversity claims or the water claims or the agroforestry claims, so it is as open and as clear as possible. No screens, basically. So what I keep hearing all the time, for example, on that Florida project is, if you're telling me that you're selling X amount of beans of this tree at X price, why can't you just look at it from, well, there was this amount of water captured, and therefore that is the value that it has. So it's a very simplistic view. I completely take it, but it's on making sure that the accounting on each one of those ecosystem services is as transparent as counting beans, really. So I do believe that the answer to your point is, can you prove additionality? I think it lies on the ability to open data and to make it observable, not only to the off-taker, the investor, and the landowner, but actually to peers to analyze it and question it. Ideally, also policymakers. I'll stop there.
So I'll jump in here, yeah, in theory, I think that sounds good. But if you're trying to like parse out the motivations of a credit producer, I just think it can be gamed. But let me offer a positive example that we didn't talk about, which is trying to incorporate the agricultural sector specifically into this area. And a good example may come from the state of Maryland, where they actually have a water quality trading program. So that's already in place, dealing with essentially nutrient offsets. So it's not a wetland credit, but it's specifically dealing with a particular type of pollutant. So they have a nutrient trading program that's already in place. Largely, farmers aren't participating in it for other reasons, but that's in place, and they are actually looking to use their nutrient tracking tool to calibrate it for carbon sequestration. And so by 2020, they anticipate that farmers should be able to sell both water quality credits and carbon credits, say, from forested buffers. So that could be an example of where you have a single conservation action on spatially overlapped lands, generating two different types of credits that then can be sold in two different markets to different players. But I think the key there is actually having the accounting mechanisms, as Manuel was just referring to. Thanks.
Stewart.
Yes.
I can also, I would like to add to that. And so the financial additionality argument is it's a valid argument, and it is an additionality test that can be applied. I do think it's worth going back to sort of first principles, and one of the key things to check is what is the desired outcome from a particular policy or program. And very often additionality tests then need to be applied that are more the ecological type of additionality test, because if the desired outcome of a program or two different programs is, for example, to achieve no net loss relative to a specified reference state, if the financial additionality argument and the outcomes from projects that deliver outcomes under that does not achieve the desired outcome, then it's unlikely to be a satisfactory additionality test. So that is a limitation, and that's why it is so important to go back to the sort of first principles and what is it that we really do want to achieve here. Thank you.
Okay, well, we could dig deeper into that one, but let me just move on to a related one, which is this idea. Amrei, you talked a little bit about CCBA and some of the other sort of add-on biodiversity standards. So if in Canada, we're about to develop forest carbon offset protocols, and if we were to add biodiversity requirements onto that, whether it be a no net loss or even a net positive, let's say, I guess one of the big questions is it worth it? Because it involves additional time and cost, right? You're competing in an offset market where other offsets don't have all these additional biodiversity requirements. So is it worth it from a project development viewpoint? Amrei, you talked a little bit about market demand. What about a premium return? Do you actually get a higher value for that offset in a way that justifies those additional costs that would help make the case for adding these premium biodiversity elements on top?
So when we did this investigation and we looked at the voluntary markets, so some of this information is quite hard to get at. But we looked at, work that Forest Trends had done in, especially on tracking voluntary carbon markets. And the main advantage was really the one related to market entry and market participation. There was at the time, and I'm not sure what the latest sort of figures show, but at the time there was virtually no premium associated with the co-benefits. So it was really about being a player in the market more than anything. So then the question does remain, is it worth it or not? It can't be, it could not be measured in the form of a clear, significant premium.
Stewart, if I may, just on that piece, this is from a very pragmatic market touch, is that we haven't had a single off-taker or investor in a project that does not want biodiversity included. So, and to give you a very clear example, one of our projects which protects and the offsets that we sold, we have the monarch butterfly and the and an ocelot in it. Zero specific registry looking into or methodology looking into the biodiversity, but in the project, the accounting of those species was peer reviewed, and that allows us to achieve, contrasted to a similar project less than 50 kilometers from this site, $4 more per offset, just because of the fact that biodiversity was there. So in full transparency, that those offsets sold at more than $18 per ton, because there was this biodiversity. There was no specific ledger for the biodiversity as in driven by the registry or the methodology, but the fact that the collateral around the offset was transparent and visible moved to that. So I'm just from a very specific and lens. This is not from a policy lens. We've seen at the two ends of the coin, both at the start, as from investors as well as off-takers, that it's a no-brainer. Basically, no one would invest in our projects or take offsets from our projects if they didn't have biodiversity.
Well, that's I know Paige and I did. It was not very rigorous. We did an anecdotal look at prices for different voluntary standards, and it aligns with that. We found that CCBA seems to be generating about $2 a ton more than just voluntary carbon, and Plan Vivo is generating 4 or 5 times more. So it seems like there's at least anecdotal evidence that you can get a premium price. So it's good to hear a real developer saying the same.
You know, one other thing to think about in terms of policy would be procurement policy. So for example, in the state of California, there's something called the Farm to School program that encourages partnerships with climate smart agricultural producers. So that could be sort of a non-regulatory way to try to encourage the biodiversity top off. Thanks.
Great idea. Dave, why don't I go to you?
Yeah, I was just going to say that we've got a question from the audience from Karen Diamond, and she asks, are there internationally agreed there are internationally agreed methods to count carbon, such as REDD+ and UN FCC. Are there similar systems for biodiversity? Amrei, you might be the best to handle that.
Yeah, thanks for the question. So I would say that there is no absolute international standard that is, the equivalent of carbon, because one of the challenges is that biodiversity has just got so many different facets and is so varied in terms of its local expression that it's difficult to have very clear, detailed international, methods and standards on counting in inverted commas biodiversity. However, there is a lot of, there is some agreements on, for example, the IUCN has recently published a sort of agreed hierarchy that can be adopted for example, classifying and mapping ecosystems. There is there are protocols for identifying species. So those kinds of basic methods exist, but they're not part of a sort of unified framework. There is, however, some best practice guidance, and I can point you to the Business and Biodiversity Offsets program, for example, in how you can assess biodiversity and biodiversity impacts in a quite pragmatic way and nevertheless quite comprehensive way, and ways in which you would achieve gains. So very relevant from a impact mitigation, impact assessment, mitigation, and offsetting perspective. But these are best practice guidance documents, and in different countries there will be different methods that are applied for the different types of biodiversity. So it's a significantly more tricky world to play in than in the carbon world in many ways.
So we also have a question from Hugo Costa, and this sort of addresses the economics of this question, I think. How about biodiversity and carbon offsets which are generated by local communities? Sometimes the revenue for the communities is not very interesting due to high investment and operational costs. And then the follow-up question is, shouldn't it be possible to unbundle for these specific cases where the objective is to get local communities to protect and manage biodiversity and ecosystems? I guess that's a specific application at the community level of the debate that we're having.
So the link that I would add, actually, I will link it to my previous answer. The project that I mentioned that triggered the plus $18 per ton price was with very small landowner communities. By very small, I mean less than 2 hectares in the middle of Mexico. And the key part there was, I don't think it was, in my perspective, especially as I mentioned, that there was no specific set of stipulations about biodiversity. But the answer to the question is associated to the social safeguards as to how much of the $18 is actually flowing to the communities. So I really, from what we've experienced with working with indigenous communities, not only in Latin America, but also in Southeast Asia, the core part and going back to our customers, which are our landowners are our partners, but the investors and the off-takers are our customers. And they're also asking for the social safeguards. I don't think that the landowner, being very pragmatic, they really care if it's bundled, unbundled, stack, as far as they receive a significant piece of the profit. So the answer to Hugo is, as far as you have also a transparent profit share formula that everyone in the equation has visibility to, that's what really matters, to continue to have those incentives aligned. And actually, one piece that we haven't discussed a lot in the panel is permanence. If you want with small communities permanence, that alignment of interest with profit is a key rather than the mechanism. They honestly couldn't care less. I never heard about them caring about it.
To sort of tear off of that with respect to profit sharing and to analogize to the early history of wetland mitigation banking in the United States. I mean, it was a very risky endeavor to invest in because it was uncertain whether the regulatory agencies were even going to approve this, how it was going to work, how do you invest in it, and one of the first successful ones was a public-private partnership where a private company actually invested the money and took the risk to restore wetlands on public lands, on local government lands. And so it was a relationship between a private restoration company and a local government. And at the end of the day, since the private company was taking the financial risk. The local government was amenable to participating. But at the end of the day, the local government still controlled the land and had a wetland park with funds that were provided for the long-term stewardship.
Thanks, Roy.
I think it's also, Dave, can I just add in response to, sorry, Hugo's question, I do think that it's really important to think not just of the supply side. You know, yes, it's a very valid point that communities, there's a huge investment, which is, you know, may well be too high, but offsets are about internalizing damage for project proponents. So one can't really separate the supply side of offsets from the demand side. And if one stacks and unbundles to incentivize the offset supply side and not do the same on the offset demand side, we end up with bad environmental outcomes. And that's why it's really worth thinking all of these things through so incredibly carefully. Thank you.
We are just about out of time, and I'm afraid we're not going to be able to get to all the questions. I'll just pick one here for a very, very brief answer, if possible, from our friend Guy Greenaway. Do you think the task force on nature-related financial disclosures will provide guidance for measuring biodiversity in an offset context? Anybody have a short answer for that? No?
I can give it a go. I don't think that it'll provide guidance, but might well draw an experience of, you know, best practice, as noted earlier, and that best practice would be, you know, a range of things, as, for example, the International Finance Corporation and World Bank guidance does.
Right. Okay. Thank you. Yeah, and that was the other part of Guy's question that I skipped over. So thanks for addressing that. All right. Well, that is the end of our main presentation, and I'd like to make a few closing comments. Then I'll give you instructions to stay with us for smaller group discussions on today's topic. I'm also requesting your feedback and assistance in presenting the coming sessions in this series. First of all, though, I'd like to thank all of today's speakers for their varied and thought-provoking presentations. Many thanks to Stewart, Roy, Amrei, and Manuel. Secondly, I'd like to thank our sponsors, Alberta Innovates, the Government of Canada Social Sciences and Humanities Research Council, ConocoPhillips Canada, and Teck. I'd also like to personally thank my ALI colleagues for their work on this series, especially Kathleen Bell, who's assured that the technology keeps serving us smoothly. And also a special shout out to Paige Olmstead at the Smart Prosperity Institute, who helped to organize today's session. Finally, if you've not already done so, I encourage you to check out and register for the remaining sessions in this 8-part series. A week today, our topic will be offsetting as if people mattered, social aspects of biodiversity offsetting. And our speakers will be Victoria Griffiths, Linus Hasselstrom, Scott Cole, Charlie Palmer, and Celine Jacob making a return appearance in the series. Again, thank you to all of you for attending today's presentation. Thank you again for joining us.